The HMS Royal George. Once the pride of the Royal Navy, the three-decked 100-gun ship of the line was one of the country's biggest warships. Royal George carried the Admiral's flag in some of the most important battles of the era. On August 2nd, 1782, she would heel on her side and sink in relatively calm waters of Portsmouth Harbor in full view of the fleet and town. Over 900 men, women, and children were to perish in the disaster. It was a tragedy that rocked a nation already used to wars and losses. This is a brief history of HMS Royal George and the events surrounding her loss. In 1746, the hull of Royal Anne was laid in the Woolwich shipyard outside London. However, with the end of the War of Austrian Succession in 1748, work slowed and there was a brief period of idleness before the Admiralty budgeted to finish construction of the large ship. With their size and might in mind, they also decided instead to rename an already commissioned three-decker to Royal Anne and take that ship's name for this larger warship, with the new ship now being called Royal George after the current King George II's father. She would go on to be commissioned in 1755 and completed in 1756 at a cost of £65,000. At 2,000 tons, Royal George would hold the title of the Royal Navy's largest warship for 20 years. Rated for 100 guns, the ship carried mighty 42-pounders on her lower decks, along with 24 and 12-pounders on her upper decks. Her official complement was 850 officers, seamen, and marines. With her size and stature, Royal George would go on to serve as flagship to one of the admirals in command of the Channel Fleet, where over the next several years a number of captains and flag officers rotated through the ship. It was 3 years later in 1759, under the command of Captain John Campbell, serving as the flagship to Admiral Edward Hawke, that the Royal George took part in her first large fleet engagement. The Battle of Quiberon Bay. The Channel Fleet under Admiral Hawke had lured out the French using a smaller force, and now having caught them in a vulnerable position, were in pursuit, hoping to catch the French fleet in a running engagement. The French, realizing their position, were making for the shelter of Quiberon Bay, falsely thinking that the English fleet would not pursue them into the dangerous bay on account of the poor weather and oncoming darkness. However, the French underestimated British reserve. Hawke ordered the fleet to engage, and led by Captain Howe in the Warspite, HMS Royal George and the rest of the English fleet chased and engaged the fleeing French. The Thesay and the Superbe, both of 74 guns, took a battering from the English and were wrecked. Other French ships struck their colors and were later abandoned after running ashore in the foul weather. The French flagship Sol Royal, much damaged from the fight, went aground near Le Creusac and was burned. The battle was decisive, ending any hopes of the French to invade or even threaten the British in the Channel for the remainder of the 7 Years' War, and the famous naval song Hearts of Oak was composed to commemorate the battle. With the coming of peace in 1762, status and the name of the monarch's father were not enough to save the Royal George, and the ship was laid up in Ordinary, where she would remain for the next 15 years. It wasn't until 1777, with France thinking a spread-out British navy and ambitious new American allies presented an opportunity to settle scores, that war amongst the great European powers was once more on the horizon. The Royal Navy began to re-equip their large capital ships. HMS Royal George was recommissioned at a cost of £55,000 and put back to sea as one of the flagships within the Channel Fleet. Sailing alongside the HMS Victory, who had been built more than a decade earlier and also had been held in reserve until recently being commissioned in 1778, taking Royal George's title as England's biggest warship at 2,162 tons. In 1780, Royal George was under the command of Captain John Bourmaster and flagship to Rear Admiral Robert Digby, leading a squadron in the fleet on the way to relieve Gibraltar under the overall command of Admiral Sir George Rodney, where the ship would take part in the Battle of Cape St. Vincent, also known as the Moonlight Battle for taking place overnight. 11 Spanish ships of the line under Admiral Juan de Langara were sailing off Cape St. Vincent to challenge and potentially intercept any English relief forces that might be sent for Gibraltar. The English had indeed left Portsmouth with a large fleet claimed to the West Indies and were instead making a surprise relief attempt for Gibraltar, and so came into contact with the Spanish ships. De Langara did not fancy bringing his 11 ships into combat against a powerful fleet of 18 English warships, and instead, realizing the situation, was endeavoring to take advantage of the fading daylight and worsening weather and make a fighting retreat for Cadiz. In another running engagement, Admiral Rodney would fly the flag General Chase, and the Royal Navy would set all sail and gradually overhaul the slower Spanish ships, firing into them in passing one by one as they continued after the rest of the fleet. Fighting started at 4 p.m. and lasted through the night. The slowest and thus first ship to be overwhelmed was the San Domingo of 74 guns, which 40 minutes in exploded, taking all but one of her crew to the bottom. The Royal George was in the thick of the action through the night, in which 7 Spanish ships of the line struck to the English, including the Phoenix of 80 guns, Admiral de Langara's flagship. After the battle, the weather being particularly poor, the San Augustine, which had surrendered but had not been able to receive a prize crew, took the opportunity to slip away to Cadiz in the darkness. 2 other badly damaged Spanish ships, the San Julian and San Eugenio, were retaken by their crews and wrecked on the rocks near Cadiz. It was hailed a great victory for the Royal Navy, and the Royal George with the fleet would continue on prizes in tow for Gibraltar, chasing away a much smaller blockading force and bringing welcome relief to the besieged town and garrison. In 1782, the Channel Fleet was now under Lord Admiral Howe, the former captain who had led the Royal George and the English into Quiberon Bay in 1759. Fresh from scaring off a combined Franco-Spanish force, the Channel Fleet had returned to Portsmouth to re-equip with supplies and rendezvous with the next large merchant convoy that was being sent to relieve the once more besieged port of Gibraltar. The 2 senior officers on board Royal George were Rear Admiral Richard Kemberfelt. Born 1715, Richard Kemberfelt had been a captain for over 20 years. He had served with distinction in the East Indies at both the Battle of Culloden and Negapatam. He had taken part in the Battle of Manila and had played a key role in the battle and subsequent siege of Pondicherry. Returning to England, for the last 4 years he'd been captain in command of HMS Victory before raising his own flag over her and using Victory as his flagship before he was transferred to Royal George. In command of Royal George was Captain Martin Waghorn, a senior captain with a less than typical background. He'd served as a lieutenant in the Navy in his younger years before being paid off and spending 15 years in the merchant service. With the outbreak of war, he had once more commissioned into the Royal Navy and become one of HMS Victory's lieutenants, through time rising to become her first lieutenant. In the battle off Dogger Bank in 1781, he was wounded but promoted into temporary command of a captured ship. The promotion stuck, and he found himself in command of HMS Fly, a 14-gun sloop. Waghorn would captain the 14-gun sloop for a few months before, on bequest of Rear Admiral Richard Kemberfelt, he was appointed to the 100-gun three-decker Royal George. On August 29, 1782, HMS Royal George was anchored at Spithead in Portsmouth, awaiting the supply ships to be loaded before the fleet could set sail, because of which the ship and her crew were stood down, allowing many wives and children to join the ship, as well as the standard number of dockyard wives and opportunistic merchantmen. This swelled the numbers on board by at least another 200 women and 60 children officially, amongst many others more. On top of which, the Royal George had additional men from the dockyard on board to assist in completing some routine repairs to the ship's hull, not to mention the 50-ton supply sloop alongside that was there to unload casks of rum. As a result, the total number of people on board the decks of the Royal George that morning was estimated at well over 1,100. The sinking of the Royal George. It was a calm August morning. The ship was anchored peacefully amongst the other ships of the fleet. She was intentionally being heeled over on her larboard side to bring the starboard side above the waterline so that the men of the dockyard could complete routine repairs to the ship's hull. Hammers banged out in the morning air. A sloop had come alongside the larboard, bringing fresh casks of rum for the crew. Seamen joked about who was in charge before the main yardarm was rigged and the on-watch began to swing the casks up from the sloop and into the Royal George. Families on the lower gun decks noticed that with the heel of the ship, at the top of the small swell, the crests of sea splashed and lapped in a bit over the open gun ports, running down the slope ship and out of sight below. Rats began to appear, creating something of a game for the off-watch between decks. Men cheered as kids attempted to catch the rodents. Only a few minutes later, the ship heeled a bit further. The ports dipped, no longer the crests of the swell. They dipped below the waterline, and the sea began to flow in earnest. Cries of alarm began immediately as the danger was now apparent. Orders to right the ship rang out. The crew did what they could to run the opposite side guns out, frantically moving items across the deck, but it was too late. The pressures of the inflow of the sea, combined with what was already in the hull, were just too much. Royal George rolled sickeningly over on her larboard side, the sea rushing in from below. Some of the huge cannon, now dangling by their tackles, broke loose from the pressure, crashing through the crowded gun decks and smashed into the side of the ship, disappearing beneath the water. The panicked people on the gun decks clambered for their lives up the almost vertical deck, their main means of escape the open gun ports above their heads. The people on the Royal George's upper decks were powerless to prevent the disaster and either jumped for their lives or clambered into the rigging and masts. As the Royal George heeled over, her mainmast pinned the supply sloop alongside, saving the ship for mere moments before the supply sloop was pulled under by the mainmast and broken to pieces. In a mere matter of minutes, the ship had heeled completely on her side and disappeared below the water. Royal George would then contact the bottom and roll upright, sitting in 65 feet of water, the tops of her masts sticking up out of the water where the once large ship with over 1,100 people had been. The sudden listing and sinking of the Royal George had happened under the horrified gaze of the entire fleet and town close ashore. Many smaller boats put off to assist. The first on site did what they could to pull people from the sinking hull, while others collected people from the water and took what survivors they could from the masts and rigging. In total, 255 people were saved in this fashion. Many of those to survive were already on the upper decks, as there was little the boats could do for those people trapped amongst the hull. One survivor's account. The gunport was as full of heads as it could cram, all trying to get out. I caught hold of the bower anchor which was above me to prevent falling or being pulled back into the gunport, and seizing a hold of a woman who was also struggling to get out the same port, I dragged her out with me. The hull went under moments later, pulling us both down with the suction of the ship. Upon resurfacing, myself, the woman, and the Admiral's baker grasped a hold of the foremast rigging and were later saved. Another account of a child who was playing with a sheep on the Royal George's deck when the ship went down. The child survived by holding on to the animal's fleece. The two were sucked under, the sheep struggled to the surface, swimming from the wreck, and both were rescued by a ship's boat. Rear Admiral Kempenfeld was reported to be in his cabin working through dispatches. When the alarm cries were raised, he made to leave his cabin. However, the heel of the deck had obstructed the frame of his cabin doors, and he was unable to escape his quarters. Rear Admiral Richard Kempenfeld was lost with the ship. Captain Waghorn was also in his cabin and was slightly more fortunate, escaping from his quarters. He immediately went and was attempting to free the Admiral when he was struck by a fallen item and knocked senseless. It was a single seaman in the chaos who recognized his own captain and carried him from the ship, preventing him from being drowned. Captain Waghorn lost his son, a midshipman, in the tragedy. Over 900 people, officers, seamen, marines, dockyard workers, including almost all the 300 women and children on board, perished. In less than 20 minutes in calm home waters, the Royal George had gone from ship of national prestige to a sunken hulk on the bottom of the harbor. The incident was very quickly considered a national tragedy, having far-reaching considerations and living on in the memory of England and the Royal Navy for decades after the tragedy. The cause of the sinking. The true cause of the sinking has been heavily debated, with reports and expert accounts coming out for years after the event. The surviving officers were held to account in a court-martial quite soon after the tragedy and sought to put blame on the carpenter and dockyard workers for the disaster, before blame was also directed at the hull of the ship herself, with claims that the hull simply fell out of her with rot at the time. The Admiralty's official verdict supported the officers and placed the blame on the general state of decay of her timbers for the reason for Royal George's sinking, acquitting the officers and dockyard of any official blame. The real reason seemed to be a combination of all the actions coming together on that fateful morning. The crew had heeled the ship over using the cannons and shifted goods on deck, which was not best practice in case of an emergency. Furthermore, it resulted in the lower gun ports being open instead of closed, which was considered poor practices by the standards of the day. The poor timing of goods swung up from the sloop alongside played a factor and should not have been allowed to happen. These issues were expanded upon by the majority of the crew being stood down, the watch falling to junior officers and mates amongst the crew, there having not been enough skilled men of the crew employed to oversee the work. If the issues had been identified and corrected in a timely enough manner, many feel the Royal George could have easily been saved from this fate. Accounts claim the carpenter, who survived the wreck but died within hours, first saw the danger and brought it to the attention of Junior Lieutenant Philip Durham. Twice the carpenter brought his concerns forward, asking for the ship to be corrected, the second time asking for him to sound the alarm. Both times he was rebuffed by the junior officer. The carpenter rushed on to seek the next senior officer, who upon hearing the situation called for the alarm immediately, but at that time it was too late. The Royal George had begun to heel over, the waves pouring in. Although acquitted, Captain Martin Waghorn never quite got over the loss of the ship. He served again for a short time as a flag captain to another old friend on a smaller warship, HMS Trusty, of 50 guns, before retiring in 1785, passing away in 1787, 5 years after the loss of Royal George. The 19-year-old lieutenant, Philip Durham, who had been appointed from midshipman to lieutenant by Kemperfeld, despite receiving the unofficial blame, continued as an active officer, joining another ship within days of the sinking. He would go on to be a successful frigate captain and in command of HMS Defiance at the Battle of Trafalgar. After the war, he retired a rear admiral. Becoming a friend to the king, he went on to be a full admiral at the time of his death in 1845, 63 years after surviving the loss of the Royal George. The fleet would sail 2 days later for Gibraltar, wartime necessitating a lack of sentiment, and would again successfully break the siege and bring relief to the Rock. The bodies of those killed washed up on the local shores with the wind and tides over the next few days. Many were stripped and robbed by the locals, making recognition difficult, and they were buried in mass graves along the side of the beach, including Rear Admiral Richard Kempenfeld. There would be many salvage plans brought forward over the years, the wreck immediately having become a major navigational hazard in the harbor, but it was not until 1839 that the wreck of the Royal George was finally blown apart using sunken gunpowder charges. The HMS Royal George, a three-decker of 100 guns, once the Royal Navy's biggest warship and representing the Royal Navy's biggest battle laurels of the previous 20 years, lost in Friendly Harbor with over 900 officers, sailors, marines, women, and children.